I'm Athena Carey, and I'm the instructor for Black and White Fine Art Photography at BPSOP. It's a class in which we take a bit of a black and white adventure, starting off with a discussion about what fine art photography actually is, about your creative vision and the ways that you can express it, and why we even would want to take all of the color out of your images. And we move on through composition, design elements, exposure manipulation, using filters, and then into what elements will translate your personal message, what your creative vision is, and how you can express it to other people visually. We finish up the class with some post-processing using Adobe Camera Raw and Photoshop, along with various different filters. So that's enough about me. Let's move on to this week's critiques. We'll start off with an image called Over the Fog by Suzanne Landholt. Suzanne took this image last December near Zurich in Switzerland, which is only a 3-hour drive from me here in Geneva. She says that she took the image shortly after sunrise, and that she's quite fond of these visible sunbeams that the sunlight passing through the fog have created, but is a little bit concerned about how much contrast she should add to the image. So let's pop over into Photoshop, and here we can see Suzanne's image much bigger. I want to say a couple of things compositionally before we get started, and that's that I think, because if we turn the rule of thirds grid on, that you were sort of using this as your focal point, like your subject within this grander scene, which is lovely because behind this tower you have sort of an echo of the tower in the background, and the two work very well together. So compositionally, I think it's a very strong image. You have all of these beautiful layers here in the foreground, lots and lots of leading lines pulling us through the image. Where it falls apart a tiny bit is with the tones. So we talk about tones a lot in my black and white course, as you can imagine, but it's also very important in color images. So one thing to always remember is that visually we are extremely attracted to bright areas and to contrast. So when you look through this image, you can see that we have some bright areas over here, and that's fantastic because it creates contrast with your subject. Unfortunately, we also have a very bright area right here, and it has a lot of contrast with the foreground tree line. And so what we want to do is eliminate this distraction, and there are a couple of ways that we can do it. We could try to fidget with the tones here to bring the contrast down in that section, but because the tree line is so jagged and so sort of detailed, to do it believingly would be very difficult. Rather, I'm going to use the clone stamp tool to take it out. So let's look at my suggestions for you. We'll turn them all on. This is where we'd like to go. It's a few tonal shifts in addition to that cloning. So we'll turn them off piece by piece. There's the tonal adjustments, and here is the layer where I took away that distracting high contrast area away from your subject. So really, really very simple. In this case, I simply duplicated your original onto a new layer by right-clicking on this portion and choosing duplicate layer. And that gave us this layer right here, and I used the clone stamp tool, which is S on the keyboard, or you can take it out of the toolbox over here. And I selected this section here because there's no bright contrast in this section here, and then simply painted it right over the area that was creating a problem for us. So when you see that layer turned on, you can see that now that distraction is completely eliminated. We do, I think, also have a slight tilt in the image. Whether or not the tilt is a true tilt, we have sort of two things to consider. There's the real horizon, which is lovely to keep straight, but then there's also a perceived horizon, which may not actually be the real horizon. In this case, this tree line is perceptually like the horizon in the image, and it seems very much to be slanting to the right. So straightening that out would fix the last little problem with composition. I do have one more suggestion for you before we move on, and that's to maybe consider a different orientation for this image. Right now you have it horizontal in landscape mode, which is very much what we think of when we consider shooting landscape images. In fact, it's called landscape orientation. So they seem to go hand in hand, but sometimes a vertical orientation will actually work better for the scene that we have. In this case, the majority of the interest in this image lies within this left side of the image. And while the fog rays over here are interesting, they don't add a lot to the image. So lastly, and this would also eliminate your distraction on the right, would be a consideration to perhaps reorientate the image to being a vertical, and you don't have to even lose this gorgeous little echo of your tower in the background. Thank you so much for participating this week, Suzanne. Next, we're going to look at Robert Wilson's image called Peggys Cove Harbor at Dusk. Now, this is a fantastic image. I love fog. I love it for the mystery it adds to an image, and I love it for the wonderful way that it can sort of cover up some of the distracting elements in our lives and simplify a scene. So, Robert, I think you've done a really good job with the situations you had at hand. You had some complications that you very creatively overcame, and I think that you've done a really good job with the composition as well. So let's pop out to your image in Photoshop so we can see it larger. Now, this is where we've started. I do have a couple of suggestions for you. I'd like to make some tonal adjustments to this image so that we can focus a little bit more sharply where we have people looking inside the image. Now, we have an opportunity with tones to manipulate how people see our images. We should definitely take advantage of that. In addition, I want to eliminate a little bit of the muck on this side, and the reason for that is that you have an incredibly strong line through this image. We come in and we travel along the shoreline here very well. However, with the contrast that's created between these elements here, we can get pulled off course a little bit. Now, I don't want to completely eliminate this. I just want to make it a little bit less commanding so that we don't get so pulled off course. So let's look at my suggestions all together, and then we'll step backwards through them. This is ultimately where I'd like to take us with your image. And these, don't be afraid, are the steps that we're going to use to get there. They are just a noise reduction layer here. You can see the effect that that had. And the reason for that for me is that this is already a soft image. Fog creates a softness, and so digital noise in the image works against that for us. And then we have a few, four actually, tonal adjustments. And the reason that there's so many of them is because I've masked them in separately, meaning that I wanted to do adjustments that only applied to certain areas of the image. And so with the mask, I've painted those adjustments in only where I wish them to show up. And so taking them off one by one, we'll come back through them, don't worry. Those are the tonal adjustments there. And then where I began was to eliminate only this bottom part of the muck on the left-hand side. You can see the effect that that has. It's a quite powerful line joining up with this portion right here as it is, but if we remove the bottom part, it really just only continues the melody we have flowing through these areas, which mostly follows the line of the image. So in effect, we've removed a distracting element and we've strengthened the line of the image by not allowing it to pull out onto the left side of the frame. So now let's get into the fun stuff, the tonal adjustments. So I've chosen to use one of our simplest tools in Photoshop, which is a levels adjustment layer. And so in this case, what I wanted to do was to add a little bit of soft contrast. So if you look here into the tool, you can see that I have darkened up your darks and I have lightened up your midtones to create contrast only between those two elements. And then I've masked it in along the line of the image. And the next thing that I wanted to do was I wanted to lighten up this very dark bottom layer that you have here. So what I've done is gone in and I've used the bottom part of the tool to lighten up your shadows and then masked it in only to that bottom portion. Now that lifts the image up quite significantly now, visually and the emotional feeling of the image. So the next adjustment is to darken the highlights. What we're going to do here you can see I've pulled the highlight slider in the lower portion of the tool to the left, and that is going to darken those highlights. And then I've applied it in only to the top portion. This is pulling back the effect into the image of your fog. So we've lightened up the line through the middle here, the important parts of the image, but now we're darkening the top part. Again, I talked about the noise in this image. If you look closely through these smooth areas here, you can see there's a bit of banding and there's a bit of digital noise. And this image needs to be smooth. So I've just run it through McFun's Noiseless, and that softens everything back down. And so ultimately, we took a fantastic image here and we added some finishing touches to it to take it to here. Thanks so much, Robert, for participating. Our next image is called What Stories This Face Could Tell by Debbie Daigle. And Debbie is currently in Granada, enjoying some time there, meeting beautiful people. And she had the opportunity to photograph this lady in one of the marketplaces. And she's a little bit concerned about if she's overprocessed the face. Her ultimate goal was to capture and express this lady's character. So let's pop into Photoshop, where we can look at your image much bigger, Debbie. Compositionally, to me, it is the type of image that can work when it's center position. You see that your subject is very, very much within the center. The other thing is when you're cropping things, be very careful about how you do it. Things need to look decisive, and when you trim the edges like this, by either touching the edge of the frame with part of your subject or by clipping it ever so slightly, those things look accidental. So let's talk about the light now. Unfortunately, you were working with some pretty severe light here, and it's not doing very nice things to her face. As you can see, we've got a very hard reflection of the light running right across the middle of her face, and the light is then falling off on the sides very evenly. And so you have this evenly lit, which sounds great, but in portraiture really isn't, effect that's happening here. So that's working against you here. The other thing is that the bottom part of the scene is very bright. And so what's happening here is the brightest feeling part of the image is down here. And that's not the part of the image, that's your subject. So our attention is being pulled away from this very, very strong subject. So in real life, you could perhaps ask to shoot her from a different position. After you bought the limes, maybe ask her to tilt sideways a little bit so the light would be hitting her face in a slightly different direction. After the fact, we can make some adjustments. I have some suggestions for you. They're all going to be what we call tonal adjustments in Photoshop, and what they will do is affect the way that we see the image, and it will trick us a little bit into thinking the light was different. So let's turn all the suggestions on together and see where we'd like to go. And you can see the dramatic effect that these adjustments have. We're now not so strongly focused on this front part of her face. It's almost as if we've given her back the proper shape of her face. So the first thing I wanted to do was darken the highlights in this image, because that's where it's going wrong tonally. And so what I've done on this layer is to darken the highlights in the lower portion of the tool. However, I don't want it to impact the entire image. I only want to apply this effect to this part of the top of the image, to the lower portion of the image that's so bright, and to the center vertical of her face. And you can see that that's how I've masked it in. And when we turn this effect on, it's only being applied to those places. So the next part is we need to go a little bit further here. We've made some adjustments here across the highlights, but this section of her face is still too bright. It's changing the way we perceive the shape of her face. And so it's another layer, almost exactly the same adjustment, a little bit softer. And this time I've also darkened up the midtones a little bit. And when we turn that on, you can see again, it's like we're playing with the light inside the image. Lastly, on the tonal adjustments like this, we're going to darken the highlights of the background. So now it looks like the light around her is not so bright, but the light on her is intentional. And lastly, because some of the things that we've done here by darkening the highlights have made the image appear a bit flat, we're going to rebalance things out a little bit here. And you can see that what I've done is I've lightened up mid-tones and highlights to counter the effect that we've had. But I don't want to apply it globally. I just want to use it to rebalance the image. And so again, we have a mask here of how I've painted it in, and that takes us to here. So ultimately what we've done is, while we couldn't play with the light for real on the day, we're playing with the tones of the image to adjust how we perceive the light in the image. And so we've gone from here, where the light is distracting us a bit at the bottom and making the shape of her face seem a little bit strange, to here, where everything's a little more leveled out. We're not distracted anymore, and we can focus all of our attention on this fabulous woman's face. So I want to say thank you to you, Debbie, for participating. Enjoy the rest of your time while you're there, and take many, many more pictures. So moving on, our next image is called Watkins Glen Falls by Bob Kirschke. I know this area because I'm actually from this part of the world originally before I started on my global adventures. Bob didn't leave us any comments on how he made the image or time of day, so we're just going to pop straight into the Photoshop version of it where we can see it so much better. So compositionally, this image is very strong, shutter speed wise as well. So let's go into these suggestions. We've got a couple of tonal adjustments here, and then we have a blank layer where I've used the healing brush tool to paint some detail into these images. So let's turn that off and zoom right in. And so you can see here that it's overexposed. It's gone completely white. It's clipped, and all the detail is lost from this area. So what I did was I've taken the healing brush tool here and chosen the one that allows me to sample, which is the second one down. And then I have sampled through this area here and painted it back into that area. Turn that layer on, you can see the effect of doing that. We now have some detail back into this area, which is going to look very nice printed. The next thing I want to do are some tonal adjustments. And I have two things in mind that I want to achieve. I want to darken this area up here, even though we are mentally aware that this bottom portion is really meant to be a frame and not the subject. Visually, on some subconscious deep level, we're attracted to it. So what we're going to do is, again, a levels adjustment layer. We're going to pull down the brightness of the highlights, and then so that it doesn't start to look flat and ugly, we're going to darken just a little bit the midtones as well. So we're darkening these two things together. And then we're going to paint it in with a mask only to the sections here that you see that are not green. So now we're not so attracted anymore to this bottom part of the image, which is fine because that's not where the subject is. It leaves us free to explore here. The next thing and the last thing I want to do for this image is create a little bit more attention for the bridge, because I think this is a fantastic human element in this very primal nature scene. And so again, what I've done is I have darkened up the highlights and I have darkened up the midtones to make contrast between this portion and the area behind it. So we're darkening up the bridge, and I'm going to take a little bit of the outsides because if you choose the bridge alone, it's going to look very artificial. And so those areas will become darker. We've masked them in. And then they create contrast with the brighter areas behind. And really, these are the only suggestions I have. This is a very, very well done image already to start with. So the suggestions take us just from here to here, finishing little touches. And finally, for our last critique, we're going to go on a morning sail with Rosebud's Photography. Let's take a look at it a little bit bigger over here in Photoshop. So a couple of things compositionally are happening in this image. One, the first one that strikes me is that all of your strong elements are pretty much right through the image's middle. You do have a nice balancing element over here, and that saves you a little bit from this centered subject syndrome, but perhaps even sacrificing that and cropping this right hand portion off would be a nice option. The second thing, and this is something that a lot of people don't pay attention to, is how these elements are relating to each other within the image. How the elements in the image relate to each other through touch sends a message. So right here we have a foreground element, this boat. visually touching a very far background element, which is the lighthouse. Whenever possible, don't have your strongest images touching each other. A little bit of space here. Perhaps had you waited a little bit longer for the boat to progress towards the right until the sail wasn't visually clipping the bottom of the lighthouse. So those are the compositional things. So a couple of things that I want to talk about in this image. The first one is the color. To me, the colors in this image are a bit bizarre. We'll start here with photo filters, and that's going to be with correcting color. So turning these adjustments on, you can see that I've shifted into blues and pinks. So let's look at the very, very simple way that I did that. It's 2 photo filters. You can see that I have added one here that is, let's go back into properties, a cooling filter. So in this case, I chose a cooling filter because I know that they're blue, and I wanted to pull those cyan teal colors back to being blue. And so this I've allowed to be a global adjustment. And what that means is I've used no mask. This adjustment is being applied to the entire image from edge to edge. So if we look at that separately, you can see we've gone from this greenish teal color to blue. Now, in addition to that, I want to add a little bit more interest to the sky by adding a slight pink hue to this area that I've already lightened. And that gives us sort of the early morning feeling to the blue sky. Now, this one I didn't want to apply globally. So if you look at the settings here, you can see I've just chosen the first warming filter, and then I've layered it in with a mask. And the reason for that is that if you have a color in the sky, it's going to reflect into your water as well. So when you change the colors in your sky, if you have water at the bottom, you need to apply the same effect, but not to the same degree. So the photo filters take us from here to here. But another way that you can fix images that have a strange color cast is by taking them to black and white. And so if we were to do that here with a very simple conversion, we would go from here to here. So we'll talk about that. It's just the simple black and white conversion out of the adjustment tools for Photoshop. One click and voila. And then I've added a levels adjustment in here to give what I call a tonal hug. Sometimes if the edges of the frame are too bright, we visually sort of fall out of the image. And so what I've done here is I have darkened your midtones and darkened your highlights and then masked it in so that this only shows up at the top, bottom, and in this case, a little bit through the middle because that's the way that the sky was toned. And that takes us from here to here. So thank you, Rosebud Photography, for participating. I had a nice time with your sailing image.